It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Gerard Hutchinson. He is currently the professor and unit lead in psychiatry at the School of Medicine, Faculty of Medical Sciences at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. He also serves as the academic coordinator and first examiner of the MSc Clinical Psychology Program, St. Augustine campus. He also functions as the head of psychiatry at the North Central Regional Health Authority.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Suggins, Madam Chairperson, and of course, Dr. Dunn. And I'd first like to congratulate the organizers on this conference and workshop. I think it's well needed, and I hope it will be the platform for increasing the visibility and understanding of the concepts related to disability in our society. So my talk is, as the label says, is lifting the burden, the future of disability. So I'm going to attempt to look at the perception of disability and why it constitutes a burden, and how or what kind of strategies we could perhaps think about in terms of lifting that burden and therefore altering the future of disability and the future the future perspectives that will come to bear regarding disability. I think the first point to note is that although the idea of disability comes about because of the biological reality of some kind of perceived deficit, or in some cases sensory deficit, it always will be a social construct, meaning that the perception of that deficit and the reactions to that deficit will be always a function of the society in which the person lives, as well as the time in which the person lives. So in Trinidad and Tobago, I've been following this story over the past few months, and it talks about the closure of the school for the blind in Santa Cruz, which, according to the story, occurred in September last year. And up to now, again, there hasn't been an appropriate response, it seems, from the stakeholders regarding the reopening of the school. And in that last paragraph, it says that children who are under 12 must go to school, it's the law, but yet these children have been denied that opportunity for such a long time. And those students who did apply to regular schools were refused by the principals of those schools. So it tells the story of the challenges that people will perceive to be disabled, and in this case, a particular disability that, of course, would influence the way they are schooled, are being treated in the society. And as recently as 1 week ago, the story continued. The previous slide was an article in February, so 2 months later, nothing has happened. And again, the idea that this denial of the right to be educated now for almost an entire school year is shameful and criminal. And again, just yesterday, a story about the Blind Welfare Association being locked. And it was interesting that this so really parallels the situation with the school, because again here, the headquarters apparently have been closed since October last year because it did not have a fire certificate. And workers have been using it because they, of course, have no place else to go, and they were saying that those who have children in school in Port of Spain wait for the children there. But they were locked out yesterday because, of course, because it's closed, occupying the building is illegal. And it underlines, again, this idea that there seems to be a disregard for their rights, their need for the kind of accommodation that would allow them to function in as appropriate and normal a fashion as possible. And again, a kind of social and political and official indifference. So this, of course, relates to the people who are blind. And, of course, for the rest of society, it might not seem as such a big thing because there are many other buildings, many other schools that are closed. But for this group, of course, this has special significance. But I think it's also important for us in the context of understanding the importance of seeing or sensing the unseen. And in mental health, a big part of what we do is related to that, navigating through what is not said, but what is done, what is not actually expressed, but what is felt. And I think in the treatment of groups that are described or labeled as disabled, that unseen idea of course, difference, but also somehow inferiority, somehow being less than, somehow being a group of objects that are not quite human is all too pervasive. And I think that even in our interactions with ourselves, which I think is in some ways a mirror of that, there is that need to appreciate what is unseen, what lies behind our actions, all the fears, the guilt, the regrets, the ambivalence that we feel with regard to our lived experience as well as our histories, and how they inform the way we react to each other as well as the way we react to people who we perceive as less than, and perhaps thinking that that might be one of the reasons we do so, because it's an attempt to block out our own difficulties with ourselves. Daniel Kahneman is an economist, is a psychologist, who has become a kind of economist. He's founded an area of study called behavioral economics, and his landmark insight, which he received the Nobel Prize, is that we're not really in control of our decision making, that a lot of our decisions are made by forces within us that are unconscious and indeed, more importantly, unconsidered, and therefore a lot of how we act and how we behave is related to these shadows that kind of circle around us and within us, but that we don't have access to. And I think that is something that we have to return to again and again in terms of negotiating the way we engage with our lives and, of course, with the people around us who are struggling with particular difficulties. And the Immigration Act, Chapter 18, speaks to that in a way, and also, again, invites us to ask questions about who we are as a society and how we could amend the way we conduct our business in order to appreciate the people who are struggling with particular difficulties. And one of the groups of people who are excluded from entering the country, and on the surface for good reason, because the rationale is that they are prohibited because they are a potential drain on the public purse. But if you look at the list, persons who are idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, persons suffering from dementia and insane persons, persons afflicted with any infectious or dangerous infectious disease, persons who are dumb, blind, or otherwise physically defective or physically handicapped. And of course, this is the language in the Act, which might endanger their ability to earn a livelihood or render them likely to become charges on public funds. So I think this, I raise this in the context of what is being projected to the public in terms of the understanding about people who have these conditions, that they are physically defective, and somehow, again, this idea that their inferiority denies them their rights to be a person, to share in the personhood that everybody else shares. And that dichotomy, if you will, between public projection and private vulnerability is an important one, and of course comes back to what Kahneman was saying about these unconsidered forces that influence what we do what we choose to do in our lives and how we behave. And that in turn now led me to the story of Oscar Pistorius. Now, for those of you who don't know, Oscar Pistorius is a South African athlete who had a above-knee amputation when he was about 14 months old because of a congenital illness, and was charged with the murder of his girlfriend in late 2013. So the trial last year in 2014 was being reported on. And in this article, the print is a little small. It says, what's disability got to do with it? And the interesting discussion that arose out of this issue of his disability was that they were saying that prior to the trial, prior to the alleged murder, Pistorius had described himself as not disabled. He said that there's nothing I can do that able-bodied athletes can do. He said some people view themselves as disabled because they have one or two disabilities. But what about the millions and millions of abilities they have? So what if you have a leg or two missing? And his life up to that point was, in essence, an attempt to deny this compromise that the absence of his two legs had made. And I've deliberately avoided putting pictures of him to avoid that kind of voyeurism related to disability. And the article went on that since the middle of the mid-2000s, Pistorius had been engaged in a battle to be allowed to compete against non-disabled persons. And of course, as some of you might know, he won that battle and did compete in the London Olympics in 2012 for able-bodied people, having previously won gold medals at the Paralympic Games. And what is more interesting, and this now speaks to some extent to the future of disability, they described them as going from not disabled or not even able-bodied, but being too abled, because they said the acquisition of his blades with which he runs and led to him being nicknamed the Blade Runner, made him almost superhuman. And the researchers found that prominent use of cyborg imagery to describe him marked him as deviant and even dangerous. And on a number of occasions, discussions of his running blades included mention of whether he could use them to inflict physical harm on rivals. A Wired article described the sound Pistorius made while running as like being chased by a giant pair of scissors. So even as his disability was being compensated for by the presence of these blades, there was this kind of ambivalence about what it meant. And of course, technology does that because it allows us to override or overcome a lot of our deficiencies, but does not overcome the internal deficiencies that might have sprung up alongside these external ones. And we have continuing examples of that, for example, with the popularity of cosmetic surgery in people's attempts to change the way they look. So again, apologies for the small print, but after the murder now, or after the alleged murder, they said that the discussion kind of changed, driven by his defense team, to his extremely limited and painful mobility without his prosthetic legs. And as they said, a contrast to the image of him running past people with natural legs now occurred, and they talked about him being shy and embarrassed when he saw people seeing him without his prosthetic legs. The psychologist's report, completed while he was undergoing mental evaluation because of the crime, described him as being very self-conscious and very anxious about being ridiculed or embarrassed. Also interestingly, it said that his mother had a big impact on how he saw himself, because when he was being raised, she was determined to treat all of her children equally, and the word disabled was never mentioned in the household. So you can imagine that this created a very interesting contrast. Some might say even a contradiction. On one hand, being perceived as being super able, not human. On the other hand, without the appendages that made you feel that way, the sense of being self-conscious and anxious, a fear of being embarrassed and humiliated. And that's an important part of the concept of disability. I had an experience once where I went to work normal, as young people say these days, and feeling okay and going about my business like normal until somebody told me that there was a hole in my shirt. And once that information came to me, my day changed completely, and every time somebody looked at me, I thought they were looking at the hole in the shirt. So the lack of awareness pre the hole in the shirt didn't affect the fact that there was a hole there. But once I knew there was a hole there, one, and two, somebody could notice it to tell me about it, completely changed the way I saw myself and saw the experiences I was having. So of course, eventually I gave up and had to go home and change the shirt. Of course, people with disabilities can't do that. So that sense of being looked at, that sense, of course, of being judged, and the psychic disturbances that it causes. And of course, that brings us to the whole idea of mental illness. While I was going through the net, putting together these slides, just this morning I saw breaking news on one of the sites that the child star of US show, Everybody Loves Raymond, had killed himself. He's 19 now, and the circumstances around his death are still uncertain, but it does seem that it was a suicide. And of course, suicide being the kind of extreme expression or extreme negative endpoint or outcome of mental illness is always something that raises people's hairs and causes them to wonder about, okay, well, what could have caused that? What could have caused someone who was seemingly successful and doing well to want to end their lives? And of course, that debate was also stimulated last year when Robin Williams committed suicide. And again, in the discussion about that, you see that same kind of dichotomy or dichotomized thinking about it. So on one hand, the idea of him being a comedian and the incongruity of somebody who is making people laugh being seemingly sad. And of course, psychology researchers have shown that people who use humor as a defense can in fact be masking underlying mental health problems. And they describe those 4 kinds of humor: the affiliative kind, where you share jokes about each other but as a means of building and strengthening social bonds; the self-enhancing one, which is again relevant to our discussion now, where you laugh at other people's problems in a way this is the aggressive one, in order to laughing at other people's weaknesses in a way to overcome your own sense of being weak. The self-enhancing, where you laugh at life's problems, again sharing with other people to overcome them. And finally, the self-defeating, where you use humor in a way to deprecate or derogate yourself. And when people use humor, particularly in the last 2 styles, it is highly suggestive of underlying mental health disturbance, and this may have been what was going on with Robin Williams. But a young man who has a blog, Andrew Morrison Gerzer, he describes himself on the blog as a disability awareness consultant. He had a different reaction, and in that second paragraph, he says, while his death prompted us to have a discussion about depression and mental illness, which he thinks was important, and of course is important, he went on to say, I think it is necessary that we consider how we view disability. We need to have discussions around the stigmatization of those with disabilities, and more importantly, the fear that surrounds the disability. He said disability is never frankly discussed, and as a result, the mythology of what it could be versus what it is in reality continues to grow. And he went on to point out there are lots of people with disability who do well or who are able to function. And he ends by saying, although we will never know why Robin Williams took his own life, he said that is really not for us to know. But he says, and uses the word shameful again, for us to entertain the suggestion that disability was the primary contributing factor is shameful, telling, and chilling all at once. 2 wheels forward, 4 wheels backward. So again now he's saying that while it's important to consider disability and to understand it, it's also important to recognize that disability doesn't equal defeat. It doesn't equal the end of your life. It doesn't equal having to want to kill yourself. You can overcome the disabilities and function. But in order to function, you need support and you need the capacity to feel as if you can function. And that whole idea of depression and mental illness, the whole idea of disability that you can't see, of course, brings us to the whole idea of madness. And madness, of course, is something that the society has a lot of views about. And mental illness, as it's now formally described, is now more or less accepted as a form of disability. But how does this change the meaning? How does this change the way we understand the existence of mental illness? Because, again, we come back to this public projection, private vulnerability idea, because people who have mental illnesses, for the most part, would appear to be healthy and normal, but yet within them, within their minds, there are these issues going on that interfere with their behavior, interfere with the way they think about themselves, and of course interfere with the way they function. And it is this interference, this impairment of functioning as it's described in the diagnostic manuals, is what defines it as a disorder worthy of intervention. But of course that impairment of function is also a reflection of the society and the expectations of the society with regard to what people are able to do, and perhaps more significantly, how they're able to do it such that the society can feel they do it in a way that is consistent with its own expectations. So one of the issues related to mental health or mental illness is that it can only come from observation and interviewing. There are no diagnostic tests. There's no special mechanism you could use to say that this person has it or this person doesn't have it. So it, in essence, becomes a kind of subjective deductive exercise, which is also a function, again, of the social norms that exist. And of course, it is we who set the social norms. So in that way, we kind of define the parameters or the borders over which we can call somebody mad or mentally ill. And came across this article in a journal called Visual Culture and Gender. And I found it interesting because he describes the way mental illness is represented in the media, represented by artists, suggests, as he calls it, three things: ableism, paternalism, and speciesism. By ableism, he means that capacity to be able, that capacity to function. By paternalism, he means the need to take care of the person. And by speciesism, the idea that when you become mentally ill, you become more like an animal. And therefore, again, you become less than human. And he argues that this idea implies an absolute difference. And that word absolute is important because it suggests that the difference in some ways cannot be bridged, which of course isn't so. And that absolute difference between the disabled and the non-disabled, between men, women, children, pets, and everything else, is used to rationalize the oppression of those groups. And of course that speaks directly to stigma because it is the membership of one group and being able to target somebody who is decidedly or overtly not a member of that group as an other, and therefore subject or object of prejudice is the basis of stigma. But again, he uses the word oppression, and I think it's important again that we consider in our deliberations, our internal and external deliberations about these concepts, that we realize that the treatment or the way we engage with other people can be oppressive and can in fact have quite profound implications for the person's future and indeed their developmental trajectory. And in a sense, inherent in that is the idea that if I am healthy and I am well and I am normal and you are sick, you are unwell, you are abnormal, it means that somehow I'm superior to you. Michel Foucault talked about that being a kind of delusion of superiority, which we seem to need to move around in the world and behave as if we are normal, because if we didn't have that, we would feel hopeless and lost. So, a social scientist named Judy Singer, she came up with this concept of neurodiversity, and the idea that people who have autism, which is, of course, one of the developmental disorders, really represents people who are neurologically different. And she suggests that it should be seen as a new categorization that is different from class, gender, or race, but really attempts to put disability purely in the social frame. And she suggests that our assumptions about who we are in terms of our sensory function or neurological function should be expanded to include people who might perceive the world in slightly different ways or sometimes seriously different ways, instead of looking at them as having a disorder or a sickness or illness. And again, there are several views of that. And more recently, the concept has been refined and defined, and it's now defined as a concept that atypical neurological wiring is a normal human difference that is to be tolerated and respected just as any other human difference. And the idea of the need for this came about because it should be a response to prejudice and the lack of protection for people with autism and other neurologically different conditions from participating in life like a normal average person. But of course, there are opposing views, and some people feel that if you don't categorize it as an illness, then people won't get treated and won't get helped. So again, there's that dichotomy. Where should we draw the balance? The idea of categories in general is being challenged, certainly in mental illness classification, with the sense that instead of looking at mental illness as categories of wellness and unwellness or diagnoses versus not having the diagnosis, that all of the symptoms, all of the conditions that constitute the mental illness spectrum are really a continuum that is extended from normal behavior. And where we draw the line as to what is treatable, as I said before, is really related to the person's capacity to function. But that people who are able to function could also be operating with mental health problems and need to recognize that in their dealings with other people. So what that suggests is that within all of ourselves, we have the potential to be disabled. We have the potential to be unwell or abnormal or sick. And we have to be able to address that as we deal with those who are on that, if you will, latter or less desirable half of the spectrum. In trying to escape from that, people tend to use three general methods. And of course, these methods are driven by the need to feel significant. And the three methods they tend to use are ones where they engage themselves with authority, thinking that once they align themselves with those who are in authority, they'll be protected and they'll be saved from any kind of critical observation because they are part of that authoritative group. Then there are those who are conformists, and they feel by just being a member of a group, they're able to be protected. And of course, there are those who are destructive, who lash out at other groups and try to keep them down in order to justify their own position. But all of those reflect a desire to not engage with who you are and what your potential is, both positive and negative. So the overarching message then is that if you judge someone else, it's always an implicit judgment of yourself. And it is an exercise that indeed perhaps might be damaging yourself in terms of your ability to see yourself more clearly. And that's why we coined this term, fight stigma, save minds, because we felt that in fighting stigma, in consciously trying to overcome the effect of stigma, you would be in fact saving your mind, protecting your mind and helping your mind to grow. And that, I think, is the ultimate desire, or the ultimate objective in terms of overcoming these ideas of disability that we have. The social scientists in the audience would be familiar with the Johari window theory. And in this theory, they talk about these 4 boxes, but I've broken down the boxes just to explain, or in an attempt to explain more clearly the relevance of it to us. In the first window, it's the area of our lives that is known by ourselves and known by the people around us, known by others. And this is called the free area. So in other words, this is the obvious area. These are the things that we are comfortable sharing with other people, that other people can see about us, and that we understand and know about ourselves as well. Then there's the hidden area, which is what we know of ourselves, but others don't know. And of course, there will be times when others need to know those things. For example, somebody who might be functioning in an office with diabetes but doesn't tell anybody because, again, they don't want the stigma of having a sickness. But then when they collapse one day, they need to be told, the people around them need to be told that they have diabetes and their blood sugar is high or low, and then everybody gets to know that you have diabetes. So that self-disclosure, that need to be able to share some things about yourself that other people might not know, sometimes is inevitable. But it is better shared and more comfortably in terms of your mental space shared when it's voluntary and you're in control of how it's being shared. Then there's the area that is unknown to you but known by others. This is your blind area. So these are things that you don't even know about yourself, but people who are observing you, people who know you, people who've grown up with you can tell you about yourself. And of course, this now requires reciprocity. You need to engage with people who know you, particularly the people who know you well, to help you understand what are those blind areas, so that these areas won't reveal themselves at times that are embarrassing or in other ways compromising. It's related to the story about David Petraeus, the former CIA director, who had this affair and denied sharing classified information. He was sentenced this week because the person with whom they had the affair did have the classified information, and once the FBI searched the house, they found it. So when you deny that feedback and reciprocity, then the likelihood of being embarrassed is much higher. And then the final area is is the area where it's not known to you or indeed known to others. This is the unknown area. And I guess it's the most exciting in a way, because this is the area that will reveal itself if you engage in self-discovery, if you engage in behavior with others, building community that allows you to discover things about yourself and discover things that even others didn't know about you. And of course, that is fundamental to growth. So, in relation to that, Eric Fromm wrote a book in 1976 called To Have or To Be. And he postulated this dichotomy between having or being. And he said that materialist society, this is the Wikipedia reference to the book, seeks to encourage people to have. But of course, in seeking to have, it in some ways seeks for you to be superior to others who don't have. And therefore, all the discussions now about social and capital inequity are in some ways being driven by that. And he suggested that people should ponder more on being nature rather than trying to have nature. And he says, if you seek to have all the time, you lose your inner self. And the point of being is even more important because everyone is mortal. And if you have possessions, they become useless after your death. And who you are inside rather than what you have would be what you transfer in terms of your legacy. It reminds me of a calypso by Explainer. It's called When Basil Comes, and I recommend it to everybody. Basil, of course, is one of the local synonyms for death. And in the chorus, he says, when Basil comes, it doesn't take money, bribe, or rum. Death has no mercy. So, I'll end by saying that the future of disability and lifting the burden of disability really comes from that act, that attempt to honestly look at yourself, honestly not hide from what you see when you look at yourself, and try to engage in your community, sharing, recognizing that everybody in your community, whatever they may be, whoever they may be, has something that is important, has something to share, and to quote Oscar Pistorius, in spite of what they don't have, there are millions and millions and millions of things that they do have. And our engagement with them should be at that level, not at the level of trying to prove that we're superior, trying to isolate them in order that we will feel more comfortable about that superiority, but recognizing that in celebrating ourselves, we would celebrate every other person who is on the earth. Thank you.
Mental health is the bastard child of health because we don't get the support, we don't get the services that we need. I know that you do, as mental health professionals, you do your one service. And as to the Mental Health Act, I was just speaking to a fellow activist of mine, Carolyn Ciavello. So I posted on Facebook about a week ago, and I said, the Mental Health Act says that if, I think the language terminology is, if a person who is in your care has if a person who is mentally ill has sexual intercourse with someone in their care, they can be charged. And I read it, and I understand the context it was written, which was, as somebody who is actively ill and relapsed. But when I read it, I was like, you know what? Some stupid person could actually say, my husband could get arrested. So, I mean, the language in the Mental Health Act, it needs to be changed. It needs to reflect what is modern, because it doesn't reflect the fact that there are persons with mental illnesses now living a healthy, functional life, a relatively normal life. It just focuses on the persons who have active symptoms at the moment, and that can't help. That can't really help that can't help anybody. It doesn't give me a parameter to work with. If I suffer any discrimination, anything, it doesn't give me that. So, that's what I wanted to say.
Yes, certainly I agree. I think the idea, and that's why I talked about that continuum idea, because the idea of categorization suggests a kind of permanence. So once you're in a particular category, you remain there and can never shift. But I think the whole idea of shifting to this continuum concept suggests that you can move back and forth on the continuum, so that even having had an episode or however you want to describe it, you can shift to being healthy and normal and fine. Just like somebody who's healthy, normal, and fine can also eventually, or in certain situations, shift to a time when they are ill. So I think it seeks to overcome or override that sense of division and separateness that is implicit in the idea of having mental illness or being mad or crazy.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I am Asenath McEwen, and I'd just like to make a comment regarding People First Language, because I'm hearing throughout the seminar yesterday and today, the conference yesterday and today, and I'm hearing disabled people and differently abled people and, you know, different things. And I would like to share with everyone that there is something most people might know, though, called People First Language, where you see the person with a disability as a person first. And I would like to challenge and invite you to please use the language when referring to persons with disabilities. So a person with a visual impairment, a person with a physical disability, and so on. Thanks.
I just wanted to respond quickly to what Asenath just said. Yes, I agree, totally, people first language. But one of the things we also have to understand is the context in which things are used. The term disabled person and disabled people also can refer to, which is my preferred term, because it refers to the society that disables you. So in essence, it's not that you're focusing on whether the person is in a wheelchair or is visually impaired, but the fact that there's no ramp leading into the building is what's disabling you. It's not sitting in the wheelchair. So the terms can be used interchangeably, but it depends more on the context in which you're using it. And that's one of the reasons why I use the term. But I do think we need to be a little bit more conscious of what we say, how we say, and when we say. If I'm talking about access to a building, I speak about a disabled person. If I'm speaking about access to education, it's a disabled child. But if I'm speaking about a person with a disability who is engaging in whatever activity, then it's the person first. But we can't eliminate everything from the language just because there are reasons why some of them are still important. Thank you.
You said that any normal individual can have a mental illness, right? So, suppose you interacting with them day on day, and you notice something wrong with them. How do you go about? Because obviously they would be in denial. They would think they are normal, quote unquote. How do you go about relating to them? Why they don't seek psychiatric evaluation and so on? Because obviously they would think they're normal or be reluctant.
Yeah, the question is, if, given that people who appear to be well can have underlying mental health problems and not realize it or be in denial about it, how do you get them to attempt to deal with it? And I think in some ways it comes back to the previous discussion about how things are labeled, because I think most people, if you tell them that I think you should go and see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or whatever, they would rebel against that because of all the things we talked about. They would feel they're being judged. They would feel that you're saying that there's something wrong with them. You're saying that they're likely to be mad. And I mean, still, many people, when they come to see me, even when it's clear that they understand why they've come, they keep reminding me, I'm not mad, I just have a little problem. So the whole idea of madness, and again, that thing about labeling, is so powerfully stigmatizing that I think that it's always important in engaging people to try to engage them at their level and just try to suggest that you've noticed whatever you've noticed, and that if they need to talk about it, you're available to talk about it, or that they should try to talk about it with somebody, be it a friend or family, and really, instead of pointing it out as a all or nothing kind of suggestion, to point it out to them as something that they could do to help with whatever you've noticed in a way that would make it better or make their lives a little more enjoyable or more meaningful, rather than going through whatever they might be going through because of their behavior. But it is a very, very challenging thing.
If we extend our discussion a little bit beyond the law and perhaps the individual psychiatric practice, my experience has been living here for 40 years, that in that time, the general attitude to persons with mental health problems of any kind has hardly shifted at all. The attitude to a hospital like St. Anne's Hospital has hardly shifted at all. And so my question to you would be, as a body of persons working in psychiatry and psychology, how does the profession see that dilemma? And in what ways can the public support you, if you like, in changing the perspectives? Thank you.
Well, I think, and again, perhaps because of my own personality and temperament, being inclined more to be optimistic, I think that it has shifted a bit. I agree that it hasn't shifted very much, but I think people, for all the reasons that we know more information being available, people now being a little more willing to talk about some things, I think there is now a greater awareness and a greater sensibility about mental health problems. And again, while this is purely anecdotal, but I think it illustrates the point. I mean, just recently somebody told me that they work in St. Anne's, not in the hospital, but they were feeling depressed and they decided to go up to the hospital and ask if somebody could talk to them. And they came back quite pleasantly surprised by the experience.
First question is, how do we help, or what suggestions would you have in helping families to work with their members who have any type of disability so that those members with disabilities do not develop learned helplessness or some severe form of depression or apathy? That's one question. The second question is, how would you suggest, or rather, I would rather hear your thoughts on how do you think our societies can rearrange the image and have a new normal as it relates to disability? And the third question is, how or what ways would you suggest your profession and disability groups or people with disabilities work at having individuals who have autism, Down syndrome, and some of these other types of disabilities who unfortunately sometimes are labeled as mentally ill and placed in psychiatric institutions?
Right, there's a little memory test there as well. So the first point about that learned helplessness and the idea of giving support without disempowering people, I think it is difficult, and I think all the examples I discussed, I mean, it is important to encourage people to be functional, and of course, in that functionality, encourage them to be independent, but at the same time, recognize their needs, or recognize some of their needs that might be additional or special compared to the other people in your environment. And I think that is possible once you view them, as was being discussed before, as a person rather than looking at them as the disability or the mental illness. Now, again, it's sometimes a difficult and prickly line to thread, because you have to acknowledge that the problem will lead to some impairments or some challenges, but at the same time you have to encourage the person to be able to confront those challenges as they seek to live in a functional way. So I think it comes down to support, and I would guess unconditional support with awareness of the condition. In terms of new normals, I think that's a societal thing, and I think going back to the continuum idea, I think if the society is able to recognize that everybody has the potential to have a mental health problem or become disabled, and that risk is something that you carry all the time, that the idea of having a normal at all wouldn't arise. And I think the key really is to appreciate that in some ways we all are disabled, and the idea of normal does not or should not equate with these separate categories for disability, but just recognizing that some people, because of their particular issues, biology, exposure to risk, have particular needs. And I mean, again, going back to the whole semantic thing about names, even the idea of special needs invites that kind of dichotomy as well. So I think it's something that we have to keep working on and try to get right in order to ensure that people, one, don't feel discriminated, and that the idea that there is a normal is really a very slippery and well, Freud called it a fictitious idea, but it's something that we use conveniently and really doesn't have meaning in the societal sense. And then the third question, I think it's just about partnership. I think it's important that groups or organizations representing people with whatever disorder engage in partnership with the mental health professions, or with whichever professional group would come into contact or be most likely to come into contact with people who have that particular set of needs, and to work with them in terms of developing strategies, developing logistic ways for people to seek help, and to follow them up and ensure that they remain as functional and as well as possible. I think once there's that kind of two-way conversation and interaction, it does help to diminish the stress that people feel when they have someone who either has become injured or affected in some way, as against when they don't have that problem. So I think it is ultimately about partnership.
Yes, Professor, you spoke about, despite our perceptions of sensory and physical deficits, it is always a social issue. So I would want you to expand some more on that. But how does that fit into an educational institution where a student, in order to get an accommodation, you must submit a medical? We only work with that medical. How do we get academic staff like yourself to understand that we move beyond that paper, and therefore we cater to the needs of students and we seek to help students to be successful? I have tried. I don't know if you could give me some suggestions.
Well, I think it comes back to that same thing about awareness, because sometimes that lack of disclosure is driven by the student or the student's family themselves, not wanting to have the issue raised in a way that would suggest that their child or the individual has a problem. So I think that balancing act between acknowledging, because I think the whole understanding and belief in some instances is that being treated differently means being treated worse rather than better. And I think people are very apprehensive about putting themselves out there in the hope that they are not victimized or discriminated against for the very thing that you're trying to help them with.
I have been at St. Anne's Hospital for more than 2 decades, and currently is head of the social work department. So I want to ask you a question that a student asked me recently first, and I want to just reinforce some of the statement you made recently. A student recently asked me, Ms. Calendar, if somebody is discharged from the hospital, can they go to the clinic, to any clinic outside? You know?
Yes.
And I said, that is our hope. That is our hope. But everybody here needs to think about it. Any one of us could have a mental health problem, and we would really prefer to go to a clinic outside, any of the health centers outside, like everybody else. But who is responsible, or how would we feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of, again, that idea of having a mental health problem is so, for some people, I mean, it's internally stigmatizing as well. I mean, and this, because of how they see themselves, which may or may not be reinforced by how they're treated, I think influences that, and even knowledge about the services and the clinics that are available outside of St. Anne's and the kinds of services that are available. Again, not as expansive and as resourced as they could be, but I mean, there have been improvements over time, and I think that, again, it's about encouraging people to confront it as we encourage the rest of society to confront their prejudices and confront their understanding of what having a mental illness or any kind of other disability is.
Okay, yes, so that is, we hope to have the clinics outside and more people can go to the random clinic in the cluster communities soon. That is one. I want to answer the lady who said for 40 years in St. Anne's Hospital still has this terrible stigma, and that is not true. The media presents things and we have problems, yes, but people have been calling the direct line asking, if I come to the hospital, would somebody see me right away, and what would happen? And they come and they are seen and they leave. About 7 years ago, we actually created a facility for first-time admission, and it's really a nicer place than going directly to one of the regular admission wards.
The first one that struck me was that their research is showing, the research that they're using is showing, that children need to hear about 11 million words a year. The children from 0 to about 4, that a child needs to hear 11 million words a year in order for all of the brain-building neurons that form the base of language to take place. And so that was one piece of research that I want to hear your response to. And the second piece of research was showing up that in language-deprived homes, when a home is deprived from language, whether because it's poor or because the appreciation for language isn't there, that it is so retarding the development of the child and the development of the child's capacity for critical thinking later on in life, that it is showing up almost as some kind of deformity in the child when none really exists. It's just that the home has been so deprived of language. So I wanted to hear your response to those two pieces of research.
Before expressive language, and that is 380 times. So, the 11 million I'm not surprised about, and it goes towards the second and the first are related in terms of the importance of context and the home environment. You can bring a child to speech language therapy 5 days a week, an hour, 2 hours long. We would never do that here, of course. But if the home environment, and by extension the school environment, if they are not doing their part, there is going to be no progress. And this is not just for vocabulary building and grammatical business. The iPads don't do eye contact. The iPads don't do joint attention. And so what the second research is quoting is something that they're seeing more and more, that our children are being diagnosed for behaviors that can be worked on very, very early. And it's sad because we have homes being deprived from language aren't anymore really our homes that are poverty stricken. It's the homes where mummies and daddies are really busy. And when we look for labels, which again, labels are for cans in my book, but it's not for children. But when we look at the labels, we see that children who you would have thought had this label and they would not do very well, do really well because their parents are engaged.
So when we're thinking about disability, even in a conference like this, we have to think of the persons who are experiencing physical and sensory disabilities because of stroke. That's a very important part of our population. With medical advances, more people are surviving, and surviving means... Thank you.
Great, can we still talk?
Right,
Yes,
so I'm...
reactive to this.
Right, because I'm suffering from hard of hearing. I have otosclerosis. I already lost the hearing in the right ear, and the left ear is only at about 80%.
Okay.
Right?
You have hearing, and you have hearing aids?
Right. Now, my personal thing is that I've been afraid of that for most of my life. Right? And I honestly, I still have the fear of stigmatization of what that is attached with and what that comes with. It's something I'm still in the process of learning to deal with. My thing that I would want to share is that you would encourage people to come forward and try to train people how to learn to deal with it. I consider persons who are born deaf very lucky. They've never had the joy of hearing. And one of the things that's very scary for me to come to terms with is the possibility of losing that. Right? I'm an educator. I love being in front of the classroom and conversing with my children. The thought of not being able to do that again, right, is scary. I've had, one of my things I've had to do is change my, right, once there's more than 3 persons talking, right, I just sit down there and smile and wave. Right? When my kids have to, and I have to like manipulate my teaching strategies because I have to move around the class all the time. I can't stand up in front again. Okay? So like if a kid is asking, and there are many times, and it's been embarrassing for me, where I mishear the kids sometimes. Because I would think they say one thing, and it's like, no sir, we say something else. And one thing that I would want to throw out for the crowd here, get your hearing checked. I've been a victim of it because when I had to go and do my surgery, I had no choice but and what the doctor was trying to explain to me is like, no, the hearing problem is very common. It's just that in the Caribbean, people are very ignorant about their hearing, and they don't like to go and get it checked. And that's why the cases might appear to be low. And she did chuck it up to say, especially with males, we're very stubborn. And I admit that I'm very stubborn about it too. I'm still stubborn about it because I still haven't gone to Dretchy to get the hearing aid. Right? And Dretchy tells me I'm qualified for 2 free hearing aids, and I still haven't gone by that.
Dr. Brad's office, and a few other places I think do it.
And the other part of that is the Universal Newborn Hearing Screening, which is something that...
The goals of that month is for public, just like April is Autism Awareness Month. One of the goals is educating the public on communication disorders and hearing disorders especially. And I think we really, as you pointed out, we really do need some increased public awareness on hearing loss in Trinidad and Tobago. Anybody who ever took the time to just pay attention, Trinidad and Tobago is so noisy, especially at Carnival. Sometimes I just go home and just take out everything because I don't want to hear any noise. We're extremely, extremely noisy.
Or any indication as to if maybe some coordinated regular testing could be done in association, probably in collaboration with, let's say, the mobile units of the health authorities. Because I really think that I happen to know a particular school principal who's been trying for the longest while to have her children tested. And I'm just wondering, in as much as we know that it seems as though there's a problem, how could this problem be really addressed so that there could be a solution to it? In as much as we talk about it, we need to figure out how to really get to the core of addressing it. Given with all the noises that we have to deal with in society. So I think that it's something that we really need to pay careful attention to as adults, even though we think we have 100% hearing, we may have lost a bit of it without realizing it.
What I usually tell people is everybody go get their hearing tested so you have a baseline, so you know what your hearing is at this point, so that if
informative presentations. I just wanted to make a comment in support of Keisha's recommendation for newborn hearing screening from the point of view of healthcare providers and definitely within the community of pediatricians. We have been lobbying for years directly to the Ministry of Health, requesting that this level of screening, as well as other screenings, be done, simply because if screening programs were implemented, they would be so much cheaper to implement and maintain than therapeutic programs or funding hearing aid provision or what have you.